Hello everyone and welcome back to another exciting episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden, the companion series to Shonen Flop, where we delve further into topics relating to the manga series covered by the main podcast. I am your host, Tucker Whatley, and we have a fun episode in store for you today. Our series we are guidening is a manga series about two siblings dealing with a secret society of vampires. That's right, it is Vampire Knight. Wait, hang on here. Let me look at my notes. No, Vampire Knight was actually very, very popular back in the aughts. The flop that we're talking about is the recently canceled Our Blood Oath, or Bokura no Ketsume. Man, it had me fooled. Anyway, as always, we're going to talk a little bit about language use related topics, but then we are going to sink our teeth into the meat of this episode, and that is we're going to be talking about vampires in Japan and in Japanese pop culture over time. Stay tuned, floppers. We're going to have a bone-chilling, blood-curdling time. Alright, before we sink our teeth into the meat of today's program, let's just do a little housekeeping and talk about any sort of linguistic areas of interest. And there really isn't a ton here, except for the fact that the author decided to get quotation mark creative, question mark, quotation mark, with the name choices of his characters. Pretty much all of them have some reference to moons in them. We have the two main characters, the brothers, whose family name is Hizuki, which literally just means scarlet moon. We have Nishiyama Izuki, which I believe that is their hot classmate. I didn't really have access to most of the kanji spellings of these, but Izuki most likely means that moon, or even Italian moon, if you want to read the kanji in a weird way. You have Akatsuki Kaine, and Akatsuki means red moon. I think that's come up before in a previous episode. There was those characters in Naruto called the Akatsuki. Literally means red moon. They had red moons on the back of their kimono. Then you have the weird butler dude, Rangetsu. And Rangetsu means 7th lunar moon, so like the 7th month of the lunar calendar. And there is the Kozuki clan. Kozuki means high moon. That one might be wrong, but given the fact that everything else is named after moon, I'm betting that's what it is. And there's also a character named Alice, because Alice is super goth, and the Japanese love Alice in Wonderland. Alright, with that out of the way, it's time for us to move on to the star of the show today, the main topic, and that is vampires, specifically Japan's relationship with vampires, and how it differs from our own as US of Americans, or from the UK, or from wherever else you're from. We know vampires as these legendary monsters that have been feared for hundreds of years, but then gained popularity in fiction with the publication in 1897 of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, the Irish author. However, in the East, that popular conception of vampires really didn't exist in the same way until much, much later. However, there was something that was kind of similar, and that would be the legendary Chinese monster of folklore, Xiangshi. I do not speak any Chinese at all, and I looked that up, and I'm pretty sure that's close to the right pronunciation in Mandarin, because there is no such thing as just Chinese. It's actually a collection of different languages. Anyway, oftentimes they refer to in English as Chinese hopping vampires or Chinese hopping zombies. And these were creatures that became And these are creatures that began as folklore in China, but then spread out to other countries in Asia, including Japan, where they are known as Gyunxi. So Xiangshi are pretty easy to spot whenever you see one in fiction, because they're almost always depicted as these very stiff corpses with their arms outreached straight in front of them, hopping around to move. And they're almost always dressed in the traditional uniform of the mandarins, who were the diplomats of pre-modern China. So, the long robes with the sleeves going over the hands and stuff like that, and the kind of circular hat. So these things hop around because they're stiff from rigor mortis during the nighttime because they hate daylight, just like European vampires. And they go and they feed upon the chi, or the qi of, life force, like in Dragon Ball Z, the life force of people. During the daytime, they go back to sleep, either in a coffin or in a cave. Also, interestingly, another thing that these have in common with European vampires is that they hate mirrors. It's not because they can't see the reflection or anything, it's because mirrors are used to reflect light, which they hate. So mirrors, especially those used in feng shui decoration, are said to repel the Xiangshi. So what do you do if you are attacked by a Xiangshi? Well, because this is Chinese folklore mythology we were talking about, there are a cajillion things associated with this, but a lot of things that are agreed upon is that, of course, mirrors, they hate. You could use that to repel them. You can almost always see portrayals of them being stopped by talismans, paper talismans. So you get or a spell tag, you get a piece of paper and you get some rooster's blood and you write a spell on it and then you stick it to its forehead. That'll cause the Xiangshi to freeze in place. Apparently you can also burn them, which is also kind of a European vampire-y sort of thing. They also dislike handbells, which, reading about that, it seems that, priests would ring handbells to let people know that they were transporting dead bodies through the city, and that's where that came from. Apparently swords made from metal that was melted down from coins is also very effective against Xiangshi. I'm just going to say Gyunxi from now on. That's what I'm more used to. So up until more modern times, this is pretty much what vampires were thought of in East Asia. And these Gyunxi are still really popular today, especially in Hong Kong. There are actually a ton of movies that have been made in Hong Kong that feature Gyunxi. And in fact, I am actually familiar with these growing up. A long time ago, my dad, he actually played more video games than I did until a certain point. He ordered, this is what my dad says, he ordered a game from TV, an NES game, from a infomercial or something like that. In the early 90s, I guess when I was a baby, a game called Phantom Fighter for the NES, which featured Xiangshi, which they're called Gyunxis in there, because that's the Japanese name. And I did not know this until pretty recently, doing research on that game, because I played it a bunch growing up, and still have a soft spot for it. That Phantom Fighter is actually called Mr. Vampire in Japan, because it is based off of a Hong Kong action horror comedy movie called Mr. Vampire 3, which, yes, there are other Mr. Vampire movies, and they're quite popular in Hong Kong, and I guess came out in Japan as well. And I actually tracked down a copy of Mr. Vampire 3 relatively recently. I rented it from Vulcan Video here in Austin and watched it, and it was pretty good. It was a pretty fun movie. But because of this, I have always recognized these hopping vampires whenever they show up in popular fiction. Some other places beyond Phantom Fighter where they could be seen include the Game Boy game Super Mario Land, there is a Chinese-inspired level, and if you've ever wondered what those weird hopping things are, they are Gyunxi. They are also in the DLC to the game Sleeping Dogs, which is really good, by the way. It's set in Hong Kong. It's like a GTA-ish game, but with much more of an emphasis on really cool Hong Kong-style action. And there's a whole supernatural DLC pack which feature Gyunxi, or I guess I should say Xiangshi. And also they were featured on an episode of Jackie Chan Adventures. And they even stopped it using a talisman and everything, and they talked about the difference between Chinese vampires and Western vampires and stuff like that. If you want to see a more recent depiction of Xiangshi in film, there is a movie, a horror movie from Hong Kong released in 2013, which goes by the title Rigor Mortis in English, that is apparently fairly well received. So that's a good recent one to go watch if you want to see some hoppin' vampires for yourself. Well, hoppin' corpse boys are all well and good, but how did we get from that to sexy pretty boys decked out in Hot Topic gear? Well, we can't have modern vampire manga like Our Blood Oath without Japan being introduced to the Western concept of vampires. And unsurprisingly, that introduction occurred at the nexus of vampiredom, around which all vampire fiction revolves, and that is Dracula. Now, to understand why Dracula became popular in its home English-speaking audience in the first place, you kind of have to understand the environment in which Bram Stoker wrote the 1898 novel. Remember that the plot of Dracula involves an Englishman, Keanu Reeves, going to Romania to meet a foreign aristocrat who wants to make a real estate deal and buy residence in London so he can go move to London. And that's when, it's discovered that, he's got all these vampire women and they're keeping me trapped here and da-da-da. And eventually Dracula escapes to England and causes havoc and stuff like that. This was published at the height of European imperialism and Western European chauvinism. And it's really not a coincidence at all that the antagonist, Dracula himself, is not an English aristocrat. No, he is a foreigner from Eastern Europe. Those people who are backwards compared to the Western Europeans who are, conquering the world and spreading their culture and stuff like that. And he is invading England and spreading this strange disease to make people like him. And he's buying up the real estate, gosh darn it. So the fact that Dracula is kind of the symbol of this weird, mysterious, looked down upon and feared group of people at the time is a big factor in what was so horrific and yet also alluring about the character at the time. While the novel Dracula might have driven the rise in popularity of vampires in English-speaking territories, that was not the truth for Japan. In fact, a Japanese translation of the novel by Bram Stoker would not be available in Japanese until way later in 1956. So Dracula and the Western conception of vampires were relatively unknown in Japan until 1931, when the Universal film Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi as Dracula, would come out in the United States in February, and then later in the year, in October, the movie would get a Japanese version and release in Japan in 1931. And this is what popularized vampires, the Western conception of vampires in Japan. This version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi starring the titular character. Now, if you think about the timeline of that in your head, 1931 in Japan is a time of, Japan at the height of its imperialism and also during a streak of anti-foreigner, anti-Western, xenophobic sentiment. So these elements of the Dracula story really struck a chord with the Japanese audience and would become a big element in the early popularity of Japan's homegrown vampire stories. And the most important of these stories is often considered to be Dokuro Kengyo, also known in English as The Death's Head Stranger by Yokomizo Seishi in 1939, at a time when Japan was already fighting what we call World War II, and a little bit before the United States would enter the war. The novel is set in Tokugawa-era Japan, which was the era between 1603 until the restoration of the Meiji Emperor in 1868, so a really long period. And even though it's set in the past, it's pretty inseparable from the political climate in Japan at the time of its publication. So in the novel, there is a mysterious stranger who has a love for Western culture named Shiranui, who turns the daughter of the shogun, who is the military leader of Japan at the time, turns the shogun's daughter into a vampire as a part of a plot to overthrow the Japanese government. And this character, Shiranui, is very much supposed to be based off of a real historical figure from the Tokugawa era named Amakusa Shiro, who was a Japanese Christian and the leader of a rebellion in the city of Nagasaki in southern Japan to overthrow the Japanese government, which led to a extremely violent suppression of Christianity in Japan by the shogunate government. The religion was outlawed at the penalty of death, and Japan's ports were mostly closed to all outsiders for hundreds of years, with some slight exceptions, such as some trading with the Dutch. So all this was because that the shogunate and the powers that be feared that Western influence through contact with foreigners and through contact with Christianity would turn the Japanese against the government and the traditional Japanese way of life. And so having this character, this Dracula stand-in in medieval Japan, be someone who is spreading this strange illness or disease, vampirism, that he may have received from his contact with the Westerners in order to disrupt Japanese society and overthrow the government, the rightful government, is, of course, right in line with public sentiment at that time of being extremely anti-Western and vehemently opposed to Western influence and power in East Asia in general. It took the fear of the foreign unknown, the foreign invader, coming into the country and converting people, and reframed it for the Japanese public at the time. In the West, the conception of the vampire being this invader from Eastern Europe, spreading something and converting people, for a time was actually still a bit popular, especially during the Cold War, the early stages of the Cold War. You had a lot of portrayals of vampires as being Eastern Europeans who are like cunning and converting people, kind of like the communists in the Eastern Bloc. But after a while, that portrayal of vampires kind of faded away, and it became more popular to see vampires as like this hidden element coming from within society that could be anything and be anyone and anywhere. Think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where a lot of the vampires that Buffy faces can come from any element of her town. Anyone could be a vampire and pose a threat. However, in Japan, a lot of these early stereotypes and tropes of the vampire as an outsider, and also with being connected to Western culture, still remained, at least to a greater extent than it did elsewhere. For example, a lot of portrayals of vampires in Japan are still chock full of a lot of the portrayals of vampires in Japanese fiction look like the old school European aristocrats straight out of Dracula. You have Hellsing and Vampire Hunter D, where the vampires are dressed up in the frilly shirts and capes and stuff like that we associate with a dime store Dracula outfit. That conception of a vampire never really went away there. And Our Blood Oath kind of shares this in that all the vampires in Our Blood Oath are aristocrats. They're very aristocratic, but they're actually more of Japanese aristocrats rather than Western aristocrats. And another aspect of it being the foreign invader bringing something unwanted into Japan, that is still something that pops up every once in a while. An example I found was a 1972 novel called Ishi no Ketsumyaku by Hanamura Ryo, in which vampirism is actually caused by a foreign virus that spreads through sexual intercourse that leads people to turn into a sort of cocoon form for several hundreds of years, and if they are protected from the sun and everything during that period, they emerge several hundred years later as an immortal, and there's a conspiracy among the upper class to get their hands on this virus and become immortals themselves. I'm not sure where the virus is supposed to come from, though. Even though Japan had its own separate flavor of vampire fiction that it cultivated, a lot of the more international and Western-focused trends did make their way over to Japan and have a big influence on what was popular about vampires there. Some major touchstones between the release of Dracula and where we are today, which has influenced the evolution of how vampires are portrayed in popular culture in both sides of the Pacific, include the 1958 release of The Horror of Dracula by the Hammer Film Studios in England. It was a pretty low-budget film. It starred Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Professor Van Helsing, and along with Hammer's film about Frankenstein, they kind of re-kickstarted the popularity of horror movies in the late 50s. And this would trigger loads and loads of horror movies to get made around the world, including in Japan, where we have lots of vampire movies coming out right after The Horror of Dracula's release in 1958 and influenced by it. And it's moving away from the old style of the Universal Hollywood 1930s portrayal of Dracula and vampires. Maybe one of the biggest touchstones in the development of vampire fiction internationally was the 1976 release of the novel Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. If you want to know when vampires really got sexy, I mean, there was always a sexual aspect to vampires, the whole sucking of the blood thing and transmission of bodily fluids and seduction. It was always a part of it. But when vampires truly became sex symbols, I would say it was Interview with a Vampire in 1976. And this still has a big influence on a lot of the vampire fiction we see today. Like the start of the pretty boy era of vampires can be traced from here. And in fact, Interview with the Vampire got a manga adaptation in the early 1990s that was serialized in the magazine Chara, which is primarily a yaoi magazine, if that tells you anything. And moving even further in that direction, we of course have Twilight, the novel released in 2005. I read most of that novel. I did not know what it was. It was before the movies came out. It did not have a dust cover on it, and it was given to me by one of my classmates at my high school newspaper staff, because I had just reviewed the novel Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants for our gender swap issue of our school newspaper. She said like, oh, you gotta do this one. And so I didn't even know it had anything to do with vampires or anything. So I just went into it and I got like 3/4 of the way through it before the semester ended. I did not like it very much. I kind of thought the idea of vampires going around to parts of the world that are very dark, like Alaska and Oregon, was kind of a cool idea. But outside of that, it really lost my interest. But if it's your thing, it's your thing. Although I have some other problems. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. In Japan, the Twilight book series was actually split into 13 different light novels, which all have manga-style covers and illustration inserts illustrating scenes from the book in a very, very shoujo style. So if you want to take a little peek into an alternate universe where Twilight was actually a shoujo manga series, that's out there. You can find it. Oh, and also I was looking, and apparently I think Breaking Dawn, that weird spin-off that Stephanie Meyer put out that's from Edward's point of view, was released in Japan. I think they actually call it Twilight Gaiden. So I think the pretty boy, sexy but moody and angsty portrayal of young vampires probably received a pretty huge boost by Twilight, even in Japan. It would seem that vampires became a really popular topic of interest for manga and anime from way back in the origins of what we consider to be manga and anime today. The very first vampire-focused manga that I could find by researching was Vampire by the grandfather of modern manga himself, Osamu Tezuka. It was published in 1966 through 1967 and even had a TV drama adaptation in Japan. I've looked into it and it seems a little bit weird. First of all, Osamu Tezuka is a main character in it himself, and also the vampires in it are also kind of a lot like werewolves too. It looks like Tezuka just kind of smushed those two together. In the story, apparently, Tezuka takes on a teenage boy as an apprentice at his art/early anime studio, which was a real thing, named Tope Tachibana. But it turns out that this guy is actually a vampire who has been outcast from his mysterious tribe of vampire/werewolf people who are plotting to overthrow and enslave humans. But, this vampire kid is opposed to that, and so, like, a group of characters go and they have to fight against the evil vampire werewolf people and stuff. And Tezuka is a character there for some reason. I don't know. After The Vampires, or Vampire by Tezuka, vampires in manga grew slowly in popularity at first through the decades. In order to trace the growth in popularity of vampire manga, I utilized a website called animeplanet.com, which is a database of anime series as well as manga, manhwa, and light novels. And they have a tag system. One of them, helpfully, is vampires and also years. So I looked at the number of hits I got for titles with the vampire tag throughout the decades. Unfortunately, it also lumps together manga, manhwa, and light novels. But it does give you a pretty good sense of how these things grew and changed through the decades. Once we got out of the 60s and into the 70s, we have a few more vampire-related things show up. 4 vampire titles were listed in the database. Interestingly, one of them was actually by Tezuka, who went back and made a comedy vampire series called Don Dracula in, I believe, 1979. So in the early days, Tezuka himself was responsible for a lot of the vampire manga out there. But aside from that, we can already see a heavy shoujo slant to the titles being released. Once we move into the 80s, the number increases to 8. And we start to see some boys' love or yaoi show up, which is going to be becoming a recurring theme here. Also, the 80s is where JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which started off as a very vampire-focused manga series, first showed up. Then from 1990 to 2000, we have 26 titles. And now we straight up have just like a ton of boys' love stuff. I mean, there's other stuff as well, horror, action, but a lot of shoujo and particularly a lot of boys' love stuff. And then things start to really explode once we get into the 2000s. This is the decade of Twilight and the decade of the vampire craze when it first began towards the end. And we have 142 titles with the vampire tag associated with it. So much boys' love. And then finally we have the previous decade, 2010 to 2020, and we have 406 titles with that tag. Man, there is so much stuff here, and of course, we have a lot more manhwa now listed in the database. We have a lot more light novels, and we have all sorts of different things, but lots and lots and lots of boys' love. These numbers probably are slanted by more recent stuff being more likely to be entered into the database, but at the same time, I don't think it's all just recency bias. Vampire-related manga and manhwa and light novels have been increasing in popularity pretty much exponentially ever since Tezuka made the first vampire manga in the late 60s. And of course, the pretty boy vampire reigns supreme over it all. And with that, we have finally reached the finish line of this Shonen Flop Gaiden. Jeez, sorry it took so long to get out. But I think the episode turned out to be pretty good. But of course I wouldn't tell you if I didn't think that, so whatever. As always, I've been your host, Tucker Whatley. If you want to find more stuff that I've worked on, you can go to my personal website, www.tuckerwhatley.com. That's TuckerWhatley.com. You could find previous stuff I've done, including clips from my old radio show that I ran from 2012 to 2014. There's some entertaining stuff in there, if I do say so myself. And also, you can find me on the Twitters at Tucker Whatley. Same spelling, no punctuation. Although I don't tweet a whole ton. But maybe I would if a bunch of people followed me. Who knows? I would also like to acknowledge Keith Allison and his article, A European Vampire in Japan, Japanese Vampire Fiction, and Nobuo Nagasawa's Lady Vampire for Diabolique magazine, as well as Vampire of the Rising Sun by Fenton Monahan for The Escapist magazine. Both of them were sources for this episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden. Anyway, hope everyone out there has a good couple of weeks. And until next time, see you, Space Cowboy. For hundreds and hundreds of years, but were repopularized by the novel. Were repopularized. Okay, I lost the plot. The Xiangshi. Oh yeah.